So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Does attending church 1 hour a week make up for all of the other things that we do throughout the week that can form bad habits, create confusion about who we are? It's a good question, especially when posed in the context of kids. Is 1 hour of church enough to counter the amount of time they spend online? Now, I'm just talking about kids, but this could apply to all of us, to be quite frank. Joining me in just a little bit will be Michael Gasparo. He's an associate marriage and family therapist who we love to have here on the show. It's been a little while since he's been on, but we're going to discuss why young people are being seduced into alternative ways of living with groups of friends. We'll also discuss a really interesting thing. Pew Research Report did a study in 2016 looking at whether or not people told a lot of white lies and whether it mattered if they were more religious or not religious at all. And guess what? It was almost the same. Religious people told almost as many lies as non or less religious people. I thought this was fascinating. So the question is, white lies, where do they lead us? We'll discuss this in just a little bit. If you have a take on today's show or a question, you can head over to relevantradio.com/trending, where you can connect with me on Instagram. I would love to hear your questions and thoughts during the show. Or you can give me a call. The number's 1-888-914-9149. But this statement was posed to me the other day. Attending church 1 hour a week doesn't make up for the 40-plus hours kids spend on devices each week. A report from 2019 showed that, in fact, get this. This does not include time spent studying for homework or in the classroom. Teenagers average 7 hours a day of media entertainment. Not doing homework, not doing schoolwork. 7 hours a day. We're talking about well over, 47, 49 hours a week on social media, video games, TV shows, movies. Wow. What are they doing? Social media, again, mentioned movies, video games, TV, pornography. Remember, the exposure to pornography we're seeing is at about age 8 is the average exposure rate. Now, what about preteens, those tweens and those middle school years? Well, they're not that much better. They're spending about an average of 5 hours of media entertainment per day on devices. This is shocking. Sure, it makes for easy parenting. And I'd be interested to see the numbers in terms of COVID 2020, right? Because I know a lot of parents are going through this battle of what do I do? I have kids at home. I'm not necessarily able to be there as much. What do I concede? But is it easier parenting? Are they better kids for this easier parenting? I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but here's the bigger picture problem for the development and health of kids. Kids aren't playing with each other. They're not going outside. They're not going to the movies and the mall as often and walking around. In fact, go over to a mall. Well, yours might be closed, but go to a mall. You don't see kids walking around the mall the way you used to. In fact, kids aren't even really moving. They're living quite sedentary and isolated lifestyles. I'll repeat that. Sedentary and isolated lifestyles. This is a real problem. And if you've been following along this week, I think that this ties into everything we've been discussing. What does it mean to be human? What did Stella Morabito tell us yesterday about how the Soviet Union and their propaganda, they're using the same tactics in the gender ideology movement today. And what's it all about? Social isolation. Well, what better way to socially isolate children, young adults and adults, than to hook them up to a device. That's what's happened. This is a real problem where social isolation has made for quote unquote easier parenting, but hasn't made for better kids. And I would argue, has it really made for easier parenting? I actually disagree. Because here's the problem, and we're going to discuss this in a few minutes with Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo. Parents are perplexed as their kids are choosing alternative forms of living and lifestyles. And they don't know what to do about it. They're taking their kids for anxiety, loneliness, depression, cutting. We're not even talking about some of the addictions such as pornography, poor social interaction, poor social skills. It's interesting to me. This is a total side tangent slightly, but I really do think it's related. So I went on a walk earlier this morning, and there was this odd person that parked around the corner from the house. And I looked at him and smiled and said, "Good morning." He avoided eye contact, made a really awkward interaction, didn't say anything, completely avoided me. And I thought, oh, that's kind of weird, and I totally forget about it. Well, he parked around the corner from my house, and I'm on my way back from my walk. He's standing right in front of my house across the street staring at my house. And I think, this is interesting. I'm going to walk by the house, pretending it's not mine, to see what happens. Well, he walks up to my house, is looking at the driveway, looking at the windows, and I'm calling my husband on the phone thinking, what on earth? And this kid's just hanging out in my front yard. And then I kind of start staring him down, so he crosses the street, but then is across the street staring at my house. And I'm looking at this guy thinking, okay, I'm assuming the worst right now. And I'm questioning it. Finally, after staring at him for a while, and it's a couple minutes of this, he leaves standing in front of my house and hikes it around the corner, and I wait for him to be gone to walk back home. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, well, do I call the cops on this guy? He could be a teenager or maybe a 20-year-old. I don't know. And I'm feeling bad thinking about calling the cops. It could be no big deal. So I jump in my car, drive around the neighborhood, trying to kind of take a photo of his car and everything. But here's the bottom line. I did end up calling the sheriff and letting them know suspicious activity. But I was talking to someone this afternoon and I said, this wouldn't be a problem had he looked at me, made eye contact, said hello, smiled, or when I walked past him on the street, if he wasn't staring at his phone and then staring at my home over and over again. So if he's being suspicious, that's on him if there's nothing going on. The problem is that there's no social skill built into young people today. And I feel bad because I just called the sheriff on this kid, basically. Yet this shows this disconnect with how we interact as people, this social isolation that someone couldn't even say hello in person. So coming back to the bigger picture and the question I asked at the beginning, does going to church 1 hour a week make up for everything else we do during the week? I have a real concern for young people today. Some parents might say, hey, yeah, I take my kid to church. We go to church every Sunday. They're there. Maybe they go to youth group, Sunday school, whatever it might be. But is that enough? What's happening at home? Are they receiving character formation, social skills, catechesis? Are they forming good habits? And I'm not just talking about kids. I'm talking about you and I as well, because we are all susceptible to this overuse of technology. I talk a lot about it, my own battle with it. And do we have this foundation, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love? Are we praying for them? Are we praying for these gifts? And also practicing on a practical level how we can enrich faith, hope, and love in our life. What about boundaries? Do we know what boundaries are? Do kids know when they could be at risk of being physically, emotionally, psychologically exploited, and when to tell an adult? Well, I think the increase in sexual abuse, especially among young people, shows that young people don't have those boundaries. In fact, they lack patience and even resilience. I'm going to discuss resilience later on today. Did you know that there's a whole industry, like business model to help people become more resilient? Isn't this something that should be taught at home from our parents? But, millennials are eating this up with social media apps and so forth to teach them how to be resilient in friendships, relationships, at work, and so on. So what's the answer? How do we make this better? It starts with the home. It starts with taking our faith seriously and emphasizing the importance of liturgical living. What does liturgical living mean? It means living according to the great feast days that we have in the church. It means taking things such as Lent, the liturgical seasons, and Advent seriously. I've been talking about preparing for Advent. In fact, there's a whole podcast where I discuss it. And you can find that at relevantradio.com/trending, because Advent is an incredible season to prepare for Christ and to purge those things out of our lives that are preventing us from being united to Him. And so with that liturgical living, it also means diving into the liturgy and the sacraments. Live a sacramental life. Go to confession a minimum of once a month. If you're really battling a sin, go once a week. Find that deep connection with your faith that is so important. And take advantage of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And guess what? Kids can do this too. We need to have proportionate ways for kids to start to learn how to fast. Or maybe it starts with abstaining. Sure, giving up soda is great, but if you don't drink soda that often, it's not that big of a deal. My brother was always really smart. He'd always give up like the simple foods for breakfast. So my mom would make him these glorious breakfasts during Lent. It really became her sacrifice rather than his during Lent. Oh, the joy of having one boy and 3 girls. But I also married one boy of 4 girls. So I guess I had it coming. But also teaching kids how to give alms, proportionate to their age, to make sacrifices. There was a story that came out. I remember Karen, my producer, sent it to me a couple months ago. And it was about this young teenage boy and how he had donated a ton of diapers to a mom in need. And I thought, that's so cool. Because it's so rare to see a young boy who not only is willing to gather everything necessary to make this donation, but is also, he gets it. He understood why he was giving these diapers to women who were single moms in crisis pregnancy. Do young people today know this, or are they too stuck in their phones to lift their head up and say hello, so then we're all afraid of them? It's an important question. And ultimately, it comes back to Deuteronomy 6:5, the Shema that the Jewish people were taught to teach to their children, to repeat these words to their children day in and day out. Deuteronomy 6:5, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Are we teaching young people today to do that? Or are we going with the so-called easy parenting that does have its problems of letting them use their social media devices as they please? You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo is back with us. You can find him at the Breakthrough Clinic, doing incredible work as a therapist, and specifically a Catholic therapist, who can be found at catholictherapist.com. Michael, welcome back.
Hey, Timmerie, it's been a while. How are you?
It has been a while. It's great to have you. How are you coping in the face of this social isolation that COVID is forcing upon people?
I'm hanging in there. It is tough sometimes feeling isolated, but I'm lucky to have a couple of roommates that I'm friends with and trying to stay connected with other family and friends as best I can within the reasonable limits of the time.
I know you and I, Michael, have followed the recent book, Irreversible Damage, A Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Shrier. Your work, you predominantly work with people who experience same-sex attraction and want to live according to their faith or their moral beliefs in terms of their sexuality. Now, Abigail Shrier has come out with this book having to do with the transgender craze, about how all these young girls are suddenly coming out as transgender with no prior signs of gender dysphoria. I want to talk about this in a second, but listen to this clip. Abigail Shrier actually joined Tucker Carlson earlier this week to discuss, and this will really set the tone for the book and why it's being canceled.
Why this? Give us a sense of the scale of the change in identifications of gender dysphoria and the reason for it.
Sure. So it used to afflict roughly 0.01% of the total population. So that's 1 in 10,000 people. And it was always overwhelmingly male. I think roughly 0.003% of females. So 1 in 30,000 females were afflicted by it. And they always started in childhood. They always started with childhood gender dysphoria. Today, we're seeing a spike in teenage girls who claim to have this, and they have no childhood history at all. So we know that this is very strange. And we're now seeing 2% of high school students, most of whom are teenage girls, claiming to be transgender. So we know this is a very, very large spike that doesn't seem to make sense. And even stranger, it's clustered in friend groups. Teenage girls are coming out with their friends. So we know this is socially driven.
That's Abigail Shrier. Abigail Shrier's book is being canceled. In fact, Target censored it for being a transphobic book and then put it back on the market, which is fascinating. I'm reading the book. I've heard a ton of Abigail's interviews. And Michael, the book is just steeped in social science. And it begs the question, Michael, why are young people seduced into alternative ways of living with groups of friends so often today?
And I think one of the things she highlights, if I'm not mistaken, is that there are different motivations for young girls than young boys. So some of the phenomena here, too, is being especially highlighted amongst young girls on the autism spectrum. So there are a variety of causal theories as to why the spike in female transgender issues is so high. And I think that there are different emotional and psychological factors for both boys who believe they are in the wrong person as a transgender individual and girls. So that's one of the other things that really fascinates me is the differences in what drives a young person to have this kind of gender dysphoria show up in their life.
It's sad because at the end of the day, you working as a therapist, I would like your thoughts on this. It seems very clear that these young people who are suddenly identifying as transgender, that gender identity that they're suddenly choosing is not addressing the underlying major issue behind the scenes.
Well, exactly. And the other thing to consider here for your listeners to remember is that the people advocating this type of transgender ideology claim to be pro-science. So let's be pro-science then, which basically helps us remember that girls and boys have different chromosomes. And that the chromosomes you have help to distinguish your sex, which is inextricably linked to your gender. And so when we have these young girls, it's not that we're blaming them or telling people that they're just doing this for attention or something. We don't know. We should be humble enough to say, let's explore what's causing this psychological symptom that is distressing to you. But to physically deform children to make their body somehow temporarily align with their perceived gender is hardly loving and hardly pro-science. So this is clearly a deep issue for these young people. We want to help them. We want to show them compassion. We want to walk with them. The term pastoral accompaniment comes to mind. But let's not throw the baby with the bathwater out in terms of remembering that a young girl is still a young girl even if she feels otherwise.
Michael Gasparo here on Trending with Timmerie. He's an associate marriage and family therapist working at the Breakthrough Clinic, especially with people who experience gender dysphoria. Now, adolescents today spend a large quantity of time online. I was just talking about how on average a teenager spends 7 hours a day of digital entertainment. It could be video games, whatever. And this is outside of any schoolwork done online. And 5 hours for preteens. Now at the same time we're seeing, is this going well for the kids? Well, no. They're lonely, anxious, depressed, self-harming. In fact, it's interesting. Girls in particular are experiencing a depression rate 3 times higher than boys. And this is just shocking, Michael. So how are we seeing that all of a sudden this so-called dysphoria is developing out of nowhere?
I think some of the dysphoria spike has really, especially in the female community, been attributed to even discomfort among girls with social media heightening physical pressures. So a lot of young girls feeling so much stress and pressure to look a certain way online, for their body to be a certain way. This heightened body dysmorphia could in some ways be connected with gender dysphoria.
Right.
So body dysmorphia, meaning that they look at a beautiful young girl, looks in the mirror and sees only ugliness in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And this can be heightened through negative comparisons that social media tend to heighten for young girls especially. So it wouldn't surprise me, of course we're talking theoretically here, but I've heard some good arguments to be made for the heightened social pressure on physical appearance for women online, especially young girls, could even be contributing possibly to the heightened need to push away from even being identified with their gender so that they don't feel compared to others in that regard.
Now, this is really key, and it's something that Abigail Schreier dives very deeply into on the gender issue and how groups of girls are coming out with their friends as transgender. How essentially it used to be a young woman would be in a classroom setting, let's say a classroom of 30 or so girls, and there would be maybe that one or two really beautiful girls in the classroom, and that was their level of comparison. Sure, they might have, magazines and other types of content, but for the most part, there was this general social acceptance of this person's really beautiful, and there's a difference between she and I, and the level of extreme comparison wasn't as high as it is today. Now a kid has in their pocket, but more realistically in their hand all day long, those comparisons of beauty and actually false beauty because the images are edited and the angles are cropped and we have all these filters going on. And so girls are disproportionately overwhelmed with not just comparison, but unrealistic standards. And so I really do believe, as you're talking about this body dysmorphism, if I said it correctly, this is the new anorexia today.
And it can affect young men as well, but from the statistics I've seen and the ones you're sharing, particularly in terms of the spike in gender dysphoria, it is impacting in depression related to online social media use young women more in this area. I'm sure that young boys or young men have their own crosses to bear in terms of the impact of social media on their lives, and that's another rabbit hole we could go down another time. But yes, gender dysphoria, I do think for young girls may be, as Abigail is arguing, connected to dysmorphia of the body. And everyone has this probably to little bits and pieces here and there where, as a teenager, you might have some insecurity about acne you have on your face. But when you overall cannot see yourself.
Only?
Yeah, right. Me in my 20s too. But no, there's something about yourself that you have a hard time seeing realistically because it's filtered through this negative self-image that gets to the point of obsessiveness, and then we call it dysmorphia. And that, I think, can really harm these young girls and their ability to see the beauty of who they are.
That's Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo. You can find him at the Breakthrough Clinic. We'll have links to that on the podcast notes found at relevantradio.com/trending. We'll be right back to talk about the psychology and spirituality of white lies and where they lead us. Apparently, religious people lie just about as much as non or less religious people. We'll be right back. Sponsorship for Trending with Timmerie is provided by Catholic Singles, a dating app that connects single Catholics based on faith, values, and shared interests. More info at CatholicSingles.com.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
As I've been researching the topic of religion and comparing people who practice versus don't practice anything at all, it was really interesting when I stumbled across this. The Pew Research reported in 2016 that highly religious people are only marginally less likely to say they told a white lie in the past week than less or non-religious individuals. In other words, we're total liars. White lies. They're slipping out right and left like smooth butter and honey coming from our lips. And I want to talk about it with Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo here on Trending. Michael, what's your initial reaction to this?
Well, white lies often come at a time when we don't want to take responsibility for our actions, or maybe are afraid of even confronting somebody else on something that is emotionally uncomfortable. So my first instinct is that some of this is a moral issue related to emotional health And some of it is also about good boundaries with ourselves and with other people that are not always easy to do when we're just trying to be nice instead of being kind and truthful.
Interesting. I really want to dive into especially the emotional health side. But let's give an example of a white lie. Who, where, and why. Those tend to be things that we lie about. Who we were with, where we were when we were supposed to be somewhere else or with someone else, and why. Perhaps why we were late to something, why we didn't do something. I mean, they come so easily. And I guess my initial reaction to this, and you and I were talking about it before the show, I'm horrified thinking, wow, we're lying to ourselves and covering up for reality. And you were hitting the other side wow, we're hurting people because we're lying all the time. So how does this impact our emotional health?
Well, I think one way it is impacted by and impacts our emotional health is that we don't live in reality, like you're saying, when we tell these white lies. So let's say I'm running late to a meeting because I chose to do something I wanted to do, but I just blame it on traffic. Oh, was a little bad. Well,
Total
first of all,
lie.
no one believes that anymore in LA. Traffic's always bad. But the second thing is, when we say that, we don't really give ourselves an opportunity to reflect on our choices. So I was late because I didn't care as much about your time as I did about my time, which hurt our relationship. And I just need to own that and just apologize. Then you have a chance to make the relationship better and to be honest, as opposed to it hurts the relationship a little bit. And your emotions are going to be less in tune with the other person when you're distancing yourself by just denying reality. So, I always would just try to lean in. And first of all, I make mistakes like this all the time. So I'm not claiming to be the perfect example of this, but it would be great just to say, hey, you know what? I chose to spend a little too long on a project I was working on. I'm sorry for not valuing your time and thanks for your patience. That's simple enough, but it's uncomfortable, so we avoid it sometimes.
And we don't even have to tell all the context of what happened. I have a friend and
Sure.
we were in a situation
just say you're
recently,
sorry.
they're oh, how do I handle this? And they're making up this white lie that turns into this elaborate story. And I finally went, how about you just tell the truth, but you don't have to tell them all the details of what happened.
Yeah.
And then
Tangled web we weave.
Yeah. So I guess my first question is, why is it so easy for us to tell a white lie and not care about it? And then why does this ease turn into a bigger problem?
Interesting. Well, I think some people it's easier for than others. So for scrupulous people who struggle with maybe being obsessed with the letter of the laws your listeners might be aware of, that might be harder to tell a white lie about some things, but in others they might be willing to kid themselves. So, but one area that comes to mind is whenever you're telling a small white lie, it can be for either convenience of avoiding emotional discomfort with another person in a relationship or wanting to avoid admitting to yourself something you're doing wrong. So you mentioned a great thing, like when we have a white lie about somebody we're with. Well, I can think of a great example. If you're with somebody that your loving friends would be concerned about for various reasons, they're not a healthy person for you to be around, they're a bad influence for some reason, and you just kind of forget to mention it or hide that from them because sometimes sin likes to hide in the shadows and doesn't like the light to be cast on it. So it can be a way of avoiding owning up for the near occasions of sin in our life, or maybe the relationships we know aren't healthy for us. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
It's a reminder to take more seriously when we're doing that examination of conscience at the end of the day. And especially, right before going to confession, have I told, simple little white lies? And I say simple because it's so easy for us to excuse them. But when we're not honest with ourselves and others, again, it can become a really big problem as time goes by. Let's talk about, because you do a lot of work in therapy with young people of all ages, actually, not just young people. What age group would you say you see maybe this line as being a big red flag? And can you give any examples?
Well, I've got to be kind of vague with the examples because we can't let people know everything that happens in therapy. But I think a good example of a trend towards lying is lying about things to avoid setting honest boundaries with family members about our limits in the relationship. So any time that we have a limit setting with a parent to child or even a roommate to a roommate or a friend to a friend, it's when we say, this is something I'm willing to do in the relationship and this is something that I'm not okay with. But sometimes it's easier to blame it on other things than just own our thoughts and feelings. And the reason I see this happen a lot is because we live in a culture where it's valued to more not hurt people's feelings than it is to just be truthful. And so it takes moral courage to admit, I'm not comfortable with this or that because it hurts my feelings or it doesn't feel like healthy for me. It's easier just to say, well, so and so wouldn't let me, or I was told not to do that, instead of owning and admitting our own limitations and boundaries. And the reason this is a moral issue, Timmerie, is because when we don't tell the truth to somebody about our honest reasons for setting a boundary, we limit the depth and the authenticity of the relationship. And that's what God is. God is love. He's love, and love which it exists in the depth of relationship with one another, with him in prayer. So that's one example where I see this happening a lot, is fear of telling the truth out of not wanting to hurt someone's feelings about boundaries you might want to set with each other in relationships.
This falls so well in line with everything we've been discussing this week about what does it mean to be human? You know, what makes us happy? And we talked a lot about how we have intellect and free will, and this is a fundamental dimension of being a human person. Mm-hmm. It's what makes us so that we are able to love other people. But when we tell white lies, we're kind of just going back to the beginning by placing blame on others. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. Yet that goes directly against the human person's ability to love, to reason through something and to choose something, and to be honest when we choose not to do something or choose to do something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and taking responsibility both for the things we do and for the things we are asking others maybe to respect about ourselves in relationship with them. So it goes both directions. But yeah, it is tough. I mean, I know that there have been times where I have been tempted to slough off something that I knew needed to be addressed directly, and so I might be tempted, or I've said, given a false reason for why I have a problem in a situation with a friend. Well, that's not helping the relationship, and you deny the other person a chance to even apologize if they've hurt you or wronged you. So in that way, the white lie doesn't facilitate growth and healing in relationships either. And of course, if you're the one telling the lie about something you did to harm them, that doesn't give you the opportunity to apologize for what you've done to repair the relationship.
Let's talk about this a little more from the perspective of hiding. We like to hide our bad habits so we could lie, tell a white lie to cover up who we were with, what we did, why we did it. But we can also, on the opposite end of the spectrum, hide things by sins of omission, where we don't give information. Maybe that's in confession. Maybe that's to a spouse or a parent. What is kind of the impact of this hiding, both from omission and commission as well?
Yeah. Well, it depends on the sin, of course, because sins have different impact on relationships depending on their severity and their frequency and other things of that nature. But imagine a married couple where it's known that the wife or the husband is struggling with some kind of purity issue. And, for the radio's sake, we'll just leave it at that vague level for now. But if they're struggling with that and they continue to struggle with it, but just stop talking about it with their spouse, that's an omission that eventually will lead towards a greater rupture in the relationship, because almost all things eventually come out in relationships. The truth will be known eventually. And when it is, the longer the deception has been going on, even if it's through omission, it leads to a greater difficulty in rebuilding trust in the relationship in the future.
Michael, let's come back for just a second to the emotional perspective. How can we find a greater sense of emotional health and overcome these bad habits of white lies?
One thing I would recommend to consider for all of us is to say, am I comfortable with my emotions? Emotions are a gift from God. They're basically things that are part of our nature to help us move towards good things and move away from bad things. And one of the reasons I think people tell white lies is they're not comfortable with even the emotion of anger, let's say, Timmerie. In the Bible we hear, be angry and do not sin. So having anger is not a sin. Being angry itself is not a sin. What we do after we feel angry can help determine if we choose a sin or choose a good path. And some people are uncomfortable with saying, wow, my friend did something to me that made me really angry because it hurt my feelings. Admitting that anger we feel can help us reflect where there needs to be a boundary setting conversation with a friend. But that might risk creating conflict in a relationship. And conflict triggers our fears sometimes of not being loved or not being good enough. So one way we can get comfortable with this type of new way of looking at white lies is saying, what emotion am I feeling, and how can I use my intellect, like you highlighted, Timmerie, and my will to guide what to do next after I feel this emotion? Instead of being afraid of having these conversations with friends or setting boundaries, how can I let my intellect and will guide me instead of the emotion driving what I do?
Michael, this is great. It sets us up for the next topic, that is resilience. How can I become more resilient? That's Michael Gasparo. You can find him at thebreakthroughclinic.com. We'll post notes to that, the link in the show notes at relevantradio.com/trending. Thanks for stopping by, Michael. I'll be right back here on Trending. The Relevant Radio studio line is sponsored by Catholic Order of Foresters. Information about employment opportunities and their flexible premium life insurance plans are available at relevantradio.com/forester.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
I love our liturgical seasons. I can't say this enough because I'm already talking about Advent. We talked about it a week ago, preparing for Advent. This is the time to work on our character because who we are matters. If you haven't listened to the podcast on preparing for Advent, go for it. Make a plan, write it down, because this is a special season. Along with the week, I talk about living liturgically and that being a part of our character formation of who we are as people. Well, just a little reminder here for us, and there are other themes that we could throw in, but think about the week, the 7 days of the week. Wednesdays and Fridays are known as days traditionally that were held for fasting. Maybe you can't fast from something, but you can abstain. Now, Wednesday is also dedicated to St. Joseph. We'll be talking about St. Joseph a little bit here, as we do every Wednesday on Trending. He's a patron for us to turn to, father of the Holy Family, head of the Holy Family. Then we have Thursdays that are often dedicated to the Eucharist, this Eucharistic theme. We have Fridays that we remember Christ's passion, death, and this is another reason why we fast. Saturdays are dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Sunday is the day of resurrection. So I just gave you 5 of your 7 days where you have themes to take you through your week, saints to turn to, biblical stories and narratives. But I also have another resource for you getting ready for Christmas. Advent begins Sunday, November 29th, and I have a simple way for you to grow in your faith. Sign up to receive Father Rocky's Advent Inspirations. These are short, daily audio reflections designed to help you delve into the beauty of the Advent seasons. The reflections are emailed to you each morning throughout Advent. They'll help you to start the day with a smile and give you something to ponder. So sign up now for Father Rocky's Advent Inspirations. Just head over to relevantradio.com/Advent or pull it up on the banner on the Relevant Radio app. So Wednesdays, I like to talk about issues relating to men and St. Joseph. And I was listening to a retired Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman the other day, and he made this statement that really stood out to me. He said, "Faith is the pillar of resilience." We live in a culture that truly lacks resilience. We're just talking about white lies, and Michael was mentioning part of this has to do with kind of this lack of emotional maturity, where we kind of just lie because we're not comfortable with how we feel or certain situations. So we lie and make things up, trying to make it seem better or different than what it really is, or we try to hide who we are. At the same time, we see there's this frustration with regard to men in the culture. Women talk all the time about toxic masculinity, but I don't really hear them saying enough about how a lot of men struggle to be resilient. That is that just mental, emotional, and physical toughness that is so admired as a part of masculinity. But I'm not just talking about men. All of us, we're snowflakes. I wish we used that phrase more, but we are snowflakes. We can't handle anything today. That toughness has gone out the window. Now, just to prove that this is true, I was looking up and researching resilience and some of the latest research on it. And as I was looking it up, I came across this website, hellodriven.com. Did you know there is a whole industry industry dedicated to helping people become resilient? Think about it for a second. We have a difficult time coping. We often have no direction. We're triggered easily by the things people say and even don't say in a work, professional, personal, social, or even just a setting in a mall walking by someone who accidentally bumps into us. We get aggressive. We're not really resilient. And so as I was looking at this hellodriven.com, they have a whole app that helps millennials in particular become more resilient. They're all about resilience training and really creating that virtual coach for resilience. This is something we should be learning as little kids. For some reason, it's just not something that's being developed. So let's talk about these 6 domains of resilience, and I'll be sure to post a link to this in the show notes. You can find it at the podcast, relevantradio.com/trending. Subscribe if you haven't already. So the first domain of resilience, again, that mental, emotional, physical toughness, was vision. And when it talked about vision, it talked ultimately, behind the scenes, what I saw was faith. That with vision, you have purpose, goals, and a personal vision for yourself. And when you have that, you have a clarity in terms of who you are, what you're doing, where you're going. It makes it more clear when you face difficult situations of, okay, this is who I am in this situation, and who I am doesn't change. I'm consistent because I have a consistent vision for who I am, what I do, and where I'm going. So that allows me to stay focused, and it allows me to have a consistency of character. This is really important. I think that this is why retired Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about how faith is a pillar of resilience. Because if we don't have that foundation of our faith, understanding that God created us, He made us to be with Him, He loves us unconditionally, well, then we have no rule of life. We have no goal. We aren't going anywhere. And so this first domain, which is ultimately faith, but they talk about it as vision, is fundamental for anyone to have resilience, that toughness of character. And I think that we need to remember that, because we can go to all of these different, become the best version of yourself, become more resilient, stand up when you feel like you're being bullied in the workplace and find greater satisfaction. Well, if we don't have faith, we're going to have a hard time finding that clarity, strength, purpose, and goal to endure what we have to endure in life. The second domain of resilience that they lay out here is emotional composure. So this has to do with how we react to things emotionally and trying not to allow our emotional reaction to something to cloud our thinking. For example, someone could bump into you as they're at the mall, and you could get really angry and say something really rude. And then you turn around as you've already said something rude and you realize, oh, that was a little kid. And then you kind of start to get a little embarrassed. You go, wow, I'm not really, I'm not really capable of kind of composing myself, keeping that emotional composure, staying calm. And I think this is a really good example, because how easy is it for us, someone cuts us off in traffic, not that that's ever okay, but we don't know what's happening in that other person's life. Something could happen, for example, maybe your boss comes into your office and says, hey, I need to talk to you tomorrow morning. Oh boy, there's a storm until that next morning meeting, until you realize it's really something quite simple having to do with your schedule. You're not getting fired. You're totally fine. But emotionally, you have been a wreck ever since he said, I need to talk to you the day before. And so this emotional composure could be shown in a lot of different examples, but it's being calm even in the face of change, crisis, our own personal discomfort. It's being calm with the small things to help us be calm with the big things as well. This is a really big problem because we see high levels of anxiety in our current culture. I've mentioned it earlier today, among young people in particular. There's this lack of emotional awareness, particularly because we are so attached to our devices. We don't even acknowledge the emotions that are truly storming in at us because we're so entrenched in our device. Sometimes we can't even recognize why we're angry. Maybe it's because our eyes are tired because we've been looking at a screen for so long. Or we've been looking at the screen for so long we forgot to eat lunch. Come on, you know you've done it too. So how do we regain a sense of emotional composure so that we can strengthen our resilience? Well, it starts with taking a deep breath. Putting both feet on the ground and pushing your feet into the ground and recognizing I'm a body and a soul. And my body is connected to this world and needs to disconnect at times from situations, technology, and so forth in order to reconnect with my body. It could be walking outside and getting some fresh air. Or remembering we're social beings, talking it out with someone. Going, hey, I feel this way, and reasoning through what's going on. The problem is that when we don't have that emotional composure, our reactions are completely clouded. And we can't really think through the situation. So again, vision, really ultimately faith, and emotional composure, those first two domains of forming resilience. The third is reasoning. That is being creative, a creative problem solver, anticipating outcomes of a situation or anticipating outcomes if you react in a particular way. It's all about knowing the context that you're in, knowing the people around you, and what is appropriate, proportionate, and disproportionate to those circumstances, and then becoming resourceful even within that context. The fourth is having tenacity, that persistence to achieve something. This is interesting because I want to talk about this in relation to Saint Joseph. One of the litany titles for Saint Joseph is Mirror of Patience. I think this really ties directly into that idea of persistence. You know, it's hard to be patient when we aren't resilient, when we don't have that goalpost of our faith, that underlying pillar of faith that is so important. And if we aren't faithful to who we are, who we were created to be, well, then it becomes difficult to be patient, to be persistent. All of these things, these virtues truly do relate one to the other. We're talking about forming a holy and good character. That tenacity also has to do with being realistic in terms of your optimism. Not being blind and, blindly hopeful and giddy, but being realistic about the outcomes and the good that could happen. I think of this in relation to St. Joseph. Man, he had to have been an incredibly patient man. Again, that litany title, Mirror of Patience. Here he is. He had to adapt and be resilient in the face of his wife and his child coming into the world, giving birth in the context of a cave, in a feeding trough around animals. Not the cleanest or most comfortable picture. He had to be resourceful. He had to reason through, be emotionally composed, trust in God, and keep the purpose and the goal in mind. He had to persevere. Then he has to flee to Egypt with a young family. And with that, it required that he was physically tough. We talk about resilience. That fifth pillar of resilience actually has to do with our health. That we're eating, we've got good nutrition, we're exercising, taking good care of our bodies, toning our bodies for the sake of caring for others, for being resilient to the elements, being resilient even to being able to protect other people, carry other people, being resilient in those emergency situations where we're resting enough that those times when we need less sleep, we can actually go there because we've taken care of our nutrition, exercise, and sleep, that we're resilient enough to sacrifice to be present to others. But a lot of people have that difficult time being present because they aren't well nourished, body and soul. Yet St. Joseph had to be someone who was incredibly resilient in terms of his health because he had to travel that long path to Egypt, protecting and caring for the Blessed Virgin Mary and Jesus. Then he had to be resilient in the context of losing Jesus for 3 days in the temple and not knowing where he was, having to adapt, to search, to find, to discover, remaining somehow emotionally calm in the face of not just losing your child, but losing the Son of God, God himself, who was entrusted to him. In that sixth dimension, that sixth important domain of resilience is collaboration, recognizing that we are social creatures. Again, this comes back to our faith. Our faith is a pillar of resilience because from our faith we understand that we are created in God's image and likeness. We're created for love, to have relationships and interactions with others. This requires a give and take in terms of how we support each other. It gives us a safety net for what we stand for. We're talking about social isolation a lot this week on the show. Well, how do we overcome social isolation, political correctness, gender identity, identity politics? It comes from this sense of resilience. It comes from that collaboration, recognizing we're social beings and we need to have that connection to other people to fall back on when we're nervous because something we said offended someone. To fall back on when we need to be nourished in our faith, reminder of the importance of health of body and soul. And so I challenge you to work on resilience in your own life so that you can dive deeper in your faith, deeper in your relationships, friendships, and the work that you do.